welcome to the History for You talk show, as requested by you, the viewer. Today we'll be discussing the Stakhanovites in Soviet Russia during the 1930s with guests James Lloyd, Zara Luca, Harvey Murphy, William McKillop and Ben Lockstone. We will firstly be discussing propaganda in the first section of the show, answering the question, to what extent did the Stakhanovite movement contribute towards the motivations of workers and subsequent success of Stalinist industrialization? So, the Stakhanovite movement was founded by Alexei Stakhanov. This individual started off the movement when he cut down an extraordinary 102 tons of coal with his pick in 5 hours and 45 minutes in August 1935. He was hailed a Soviet hero and was exemplified for how human determination and endeavor might increase productivity. This was ideal for propaganda to encourage people to emulate Stakhanov's achievements. So, firstly, I'm intrigued to know whether Stalin used the Stakhanovites as a tactic to advance the terror alongside with the process of industrialization.
So this source that I'm going to introduce now was by Gustav Kluckis, Long Live Stakhanovites, and it was produced in 1936 and was an idealized image of mass support for the Stakhanovite movement with Stalin and Lenin clearly shown, which illustrates the propaganda and the clear link between state and society. It also displayed the appreciation that Stalin had as his hand is raised out towards the Stakhanovites, therefore greeting them. It also shows, therefore, the appreciation of them as ordinary celebrities and how they are seen as a group to helping advance the Soviet society into socialism. It also illustrates how the source was used as a manipulative tool to distract people from state machinery and instead indoctrinate them with the certain ideology, such as socialism, and therefore demonstrate the power of pictures, which, as shown with this one, amongst others.
Yes, it seems that the Stakhanovites were viewed as a privileged group in society. Do any historians agree with this?
Yes, definitely. I would say there are a number of historians who support that the Stakhanovites were a privileged group in Soviet society. One I'd like to mention is Robert Thurston, who claimed that the Stakhanovite movement helped to bring on this two-way relationship between state and society, therefore contributing to this spat of violence. To add to this, Louis Siegelbaum discussed the resentfulness that other citizens had due to the material rewards received by Stakhanovites, such as extra food rations and radios. So we can learn that Stakhanovites were knowingly active participants in the violence due to their dubious actions. And this was caught on by Stalin, who through himself and the use of other propaganda sources helped normalise the image of Stakhanovites, deflecting the success onto motivating other members of society to emulate their success.
Interesting. So would you say that the source shows Stalin using the Stakhanovites to advance Soviet Russia against capitalist countries?
Yes, I would say so. This source very clearly shows Stalin's vision of rapidly industrializing the Soviet Union in order to catch up with the West in a decade. The Stakhanovites were revered as a group of people that must be attempting to break targets set by managers in turn with the Gosplan, the central planning committee of the Soviet Union. Propaganda also portrayed managers as more likely to be wreckers and saboteurs, therefore demonstrating that the ordinary worker actually had more power than managers and very senior parts of the workforce, and therefore demonstrating their elevated position in society.
That is certainly a very interesting point you've raised. Thank you for your insightful contribution on this fascinating source. Do you have any others?
Yes, I will now move on to the next source that we're going to be looking at. So this is an excerpt from Joseph Stalin. It's called Speech at the First All-Union Conference of Stakhanovites and was delivered on the 17th of November 1935. It can be very clearly seen in Stalin's complete works volume editions in the 14th volume.
Right. So what is this source about? What does this demonstrate about the image that Stalin portrayed about Soviet society?
So this source was produced in the midst of a second five-year plan, which occurred between 1933 and 1937. I believe this is significant because during the second five-year plan, there was this continued reliance on heavy industry to progress to the next stage of Stalin's socialist plan. However, it is important to consider that this source was printed into the Pravda, which, as we know, was a Soviet newspaper during Stalin's dictatorship. This has the potential to affect the usefulness of the source. So, for example, Pravda in Russia means the truth. This is very ironic, to say the least, because the newspaper was very limited with a perspective which fitted Stalin's agenda. An example of this is in the section of the source named Technical Standards. An individual named Maris Demachenko was chosen by Stalin, who used her simply to fit into his plan of what he wanted people to know.
Right. So it appears that you mentioned that Stalin used the movement to encourage citizens to achieve higher standards. To what extent do you agree with this view?
Yes, I agree with this point. I think it's very evident that Stalin used the successes of the Stakhanovite movement to motivate workers to strive for better productivity. For example, in the source, it very clearly says, did Stakhanov think of this great significance of the Stakhanov movement when they began to smash the old technical standards? Of course not. They had their own worries. And this is important and a very valid point because it would inevitably lead to socialist society at a much faster rate due to the forced nature of the work from the Stakhanovites to improve their position and improve the Soviet position on a global stage. And therefore, this was a source of inspiration for ordinary workers who could try to emulate the events shown by Stakhanov and other workers who eventually joined the Stakhanovites. And this was also part of this social construction of the new Soviet man, where they could be reborn after the revolution.
Very, very interesting. So, how useful would you suggest that this is to understanding the events surrounding the Stakhanovite movement?
Yes, I would say it's quite useful. Myself and my fellow historian believe that this source is important because it's evident that Stalin's agenda was targeting the success of this group from the emergence of it in the mid-1930s. And the propaganda that was generated around the movement created an example for the workers to follow.
I see. Any final points from anyone?
Yes, so to conclude our discussion, we mostly agree that Stalin used the Stakhanovites as a tactic to advance the terror simultaneously with the process of industrialisation, since the group attained incentives from the state ahead of other Soviet citizens. And so this obviously created a sense of resentment within other groups of Soviet society, as they were unable to achieve a better standard of living, despite working diligently to help the industry they worked in to achieve their targets. Therefore, it appeared that Stalin wanted all citizens to aspire to the target of not only achieving the target set by Gosplan, which was the Central Economic Planning Committee, but to exceed these targets so as to better everyone's standard of living in the longer term. Therefore, the terror and the struggle that was employed was seen to be for this greater goal of a utopian socialist society in Stalin's vision.
Thank you very much, guys.
We're now going to take a closer look at the relationship between ordinary workers and Stakhanovites. Here to help us today are historians Harvey Murphy and William McKillop. Mr. Murphy, how were Stakhanovites viewed by the other workers?
Well, to properly understand the way in which ordinary workers perceive Stakhanovites, we've looked specifically at the accounts collected in the Harvard Project, a collection of interviews from Russian people who lived and experienced first-hand life in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. On the one hand, many workers did perceive Stakhanovites well. There was an understanding that Stakhanovites were just taking advantage of the movement to help their families, and that given the opportunity, many other workers would choose to become a Stakhanovite too.
So are you suggesting that the workers viewed Stakhanovites empathetically rather than with jealousy?
Well, in some cases, yes, absolutely. There were those who perceived the Stakhanovites to be a group that consisted of fathers and husbands, normal people who were pushing themselves physically and mentally in order to provide for their families. Of course, there were hints of jealousy, but rarely would any man have turned down the opportunity to enrich the lives of their families.
That sounds somewhat hypocritical to me. Would you agree?
It certainly can be argued that there was an element of hypocrisy in the way that ordinary workers viewed Stakhanovites. Many of the same ordinary workers that resented Stakhanovites would have accepted an invitation to become one without hesitation.
Why do you think this was the case?
Well, the relationship between ordinary workers and Stakhanovites was a complex one. The government's excessively favourable treatment of Stakhanovites created a hatred towards them that was difficult to see past. While ordinary workers struggled to make ends meet, Stakhanovites enjoyed the best food and received priority access to ordinary goods such as shoes, and they were given the opportunity to obtain luxury goods that ordinary workers could never dream of.
It seems to me there are two ways of viewing the Stakhanovites, with some workers seeing them as aspirational and a goal to achieve, while others saw them as betraying society. Is this correct?
Yeah, this is largely true. So while in some cases it can be seen that the ordinary worker did see that the Stakhanovites were only looking after themselves, many ordinary workers saw the idea of elevation to be one that was both unfair and equally unrepresentative of the way that the working society should have been formed. One Soviet worker suggests that after the elevation of the Stakhanovites, they no longer had to work as hard as the others. It was this idea of the Stakhanovite class being higher than they had the right to be that rubbed many of them up the wrong way, as one worker alleges that their word was worth more than the regular worker, as if they said a red cup was white and you disagreed, you get in trouble. So while the workers in some cases seem to understand that there was a reason for elevation of some of their fellow workers, this was by no means universal, and a lot of resentment was harbored. This was because of the disparity in trust that the state seemed to provide both the Stakhanovites and the normal workers, and was one of the major discrepancies that they felt aggrieved by.
That is certainly interesting. How would you say the supposed resentment affected whether a worker would choose to become a Stakhanovite?
So choosing to become a Stakhanovite was a massive choice, as for many it would mean losing touch with their working class roots and becoming completely ostracized from their workplace. This caused many workers to turn down the offer, as connections were seen as everything in the Soviet Union. I believe it was according to one source that the most common group to turn down the promotion were those with underlying health concerns who believed that they would be unable to fully use their new privileges. So while there were certainly many social reasons to turn down the privilege, health also played a major role.
I see. How would you best describe the benefits that the Stakhanovites received, as you suggest that they were worth less than connections with the fellow workers?
So while the most prestigious of the Stakhanovites were considered minor celebrities in the Soviet state and would have everything paid for by the state, this just wasn't the case for most of the ordinary Stakhanovites. As one worker describes their kind of provisions being literally just fast access for health reports or free tickets for shows. And this was clearly a bad trade for people struggling to live even with the help of their peers. However, as I said earlier, in some cases, promotion allowed for a better life for some. And it's quite clear that the provision for the Stakhanovites were ultimately different in different parts of the Soviet Union.
Thank you.
We will now discuss the Stakhanovite movement in conjunction with rapid industrialisation and the 5-year plans. Here to help us with this topic, we have historians Harvey Murphy and Ben Lockstone. From 1928, Stalin introduced a new method for organising the Soviet economy, the 5-year plans. These were centralised policies, and therefore all economic policy was centred around the state. The plans were directly inspired by communist ideology and were made possible by Gosplan, the Central Economic Planning Committee. So, Harvey, to what extent did the Stakhanovite movement contribute towards the success of the 5-year plans?
Well, essentially, the Stakhanovite movement created a motivated and incentivized workforce. The prospect of life-changing rewards for workers who exceeded expectations and production targets was extremely attractive to ordinary workers, especially those who were poor and struggled to provide for their families. As Stalin said in his speech at the first All-Union Conference of Stakhanovites in November 1935, The Stakhanovite movement is at bottom a profoundly revolutionary movement. It was revolutionary in the way that it gave lower class workers an opportunity to make something of themselves, like never seen before. It was for this opportunity that they worked so hard, thus contributing towards the success of Stalinist industrialisation and the 5-year plans.
Ah, I see. So you say workers were highly motivated because of the material rewards they would get in return. Do you think this motivation impeded productivity, with workers becoming more set on achieving rewards rather than focusing on their main goal of rapid industrialisation?
To an extent, yes, it is clearly evident that Stalin gave out rewards as a way of stimulating and inspiring the workforce to achieve the optimum targets. However, it is clear from Stalin's viewpoint that reminders of the job at hand were necessary in order to indicate to the workforce that this should not be delayed by, they should not be delayed by material rewards becoming more of an objective to strive for. For example, a speech by Stalin in 1931 contains ample evidence of Stalin setting out the reminder. The pace must not be slackened, he said. Either we do it, or they crush us. I think this is a telling and significant speech by Stalin because it demonstrates the immense importance that he placed on his devoted workers. He required them to remain consistent in their hard work, and he reiterated that if the targets are not achieved, they will crush us.
So Ben, it has been said that Stalin gave out rewards as a way of stimulating and inspiring the workforce to achieve the optimum targets at the best rate. Are there any other suggestions of the 5-year plans having any other impact than consistently raising the targets of the workers?
There is very little suggestion that the 5-year plans had any other impact other than the consistent changes in targets of output as suggested in your question. Stalin was a charismatic leader in terms of his vision of how the Soviet Union could improve its industrial output and catch up with levels of capitalist nations such as the United States. The 5-year plans are born out of a plan to centralize Soviet economic planning and therefore streamline the Soviet economy. Gosplan was the planning committee of the Soviet state. Its purpose was to create these policies based on the general economic objectives outlined by the Soviet government.
Interesting. So are there any other primary sources that discuss the 5-year plan directly?
Yes, a good example is a speech delivered in 1933 where Stalin openly discussed how successful he believed that the 5-year plan was in improving the domestic output of the country. The language used by Stalin in this speech openly demonstrates the socialist utopian vision that Stalin had for the future of the Soviet Union by comparing perspectives from capitalist nations against his own perspective. Newspaper articles that Stalin cited in this speech from Western capitalist countries portray the Soviet Union's attempts to collectivize the nation's agricultural industry as a failure and the policies as unrealistic. However, Stalin dismissed these press organizations as bourgeois press. This is problematic for historians as Stalin clearly has a political motive behind this attack, and that is an attempt to portray communism as ideologically superior to capitalism.
So are there any secondary sources that discuss Stakhanovites in relation to the 5-year plan?
Yes, one example of this is an article by historian Moshe Lewin, who discussed the impact of the 5-year plan and the aims that it set out to achieve. Lewin claims that the ultimate goal of the 5-year plan was to pull the Soviet Union into the modern world to be able to compete with other nations as quickly as possible, which support what was previously said about Stalin, seeing rapid industrialization as a battle against the West to avoid being crushed. Stalin set out to achieve his goal of revolutionizing the Soviet Union's economy and workforce through rapid industrialization, in which the Stakhanovites played a significant role. This is because it became a major incentive for workers to achieve above the expected productivity in order to receive special treatment, which subsequently would lead to higher productivity throughout the nation, contributing significantly to rapid industrialization in Russia.
Thank you for watching this History for You episode. We hope this provided you with an informative insight into the Stakhanovite movement. Please do not forget to subscribe in order to receive more videos on history. Thank you for watching and goodbye.